Okay, Dad, today is Monday, June 24th. It was a pretty interesting weekend, and not in a good way. A lot of things happened. I'm thinking where we could start maybe will be with Russia and Ukraine. Um, basically, we'll just call it what it is. Basically, there were two Western-led terrorist attacks, essentially, in Russia. Well, one in Dagestan, where an Orthodox priest and some parishioners were murdered. A synagogue was also attacked. Um, and the people are saying this is another. It's very reminiscent of the Crocus City Hall attack of ISIS-K and all this. And then in Crimea over Sevastopol, there were a bunch of beachgoers, a bunch of civilians and children playing on the beach, and a U.S. ATACMS missile tipped with cluster munitions exploded over the beach, and killed, I'm not sure how many, I'm seeing five or six children,
Well,
and 150 plus injured. Five or six dead, and most of those, I believe, are children. So, anyways, just to start it off, are these two events linked? And then you tell us about what happened and your analysis of
okay.
the situation.
All right. Well, they might be, but we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. Okay. This, we don't know exactly, we know what happened, but we don't know, who was behind it, what were the motivations. I think we have to be very careful about that. Let's first look at the attack in Dagestan. There was an attack on, I think, two Orthodox churches. And in one case, the priest, an elderly priest, had his throat slit. He was murdered, in the church. I don't know that any parishioners were killed. And then, in addition, there were several police officers that were killed in two different towns in Dagestan. And this seemed to be a very well coordinated attack. The attackers seemed to be quite well trained, disciplined, actually, unlike the attackers in the Crocus City Hall. Um, and they've all been either captured or killed at this point. But it went on for a while, for hours. There were gunfights, and um, they did a great deal of damage. I think it was approximately a dozen police officers that were killed. Now, I think we need to look at point out some of the differences between this attack and the Crocus City Hall. Um, First of all, there are at least some, if not all, of the terrorists. This clearly was an act of terrorism. Were local. In fact, two of them were the sons of a local official. And that local official has since, I think, been detained. He may have had nothing to do with it, but clearly the police need to investigate, see what's going on. So you had local people involved, and they were attacking, churches and a synagogue. It seems to me anyway that this could be, you know, um, um, a locally based, terrorist action, by some jihadist extremists. Those are the kind of targets that they would choose. These are an affront to Islam. This is what the way they think. Um, and that's really very different from what happened in Crocus City Hall. Crocus City Hall, first of all, the perpetrators were um, very poorly prepared. They were not disciplined. They didn't seem to have been trained to any significant degree. They were actually outsiders. They were Tajiks. You know, um, and they chose a target. We have every reason to believe that they were initially going to go after this very well-known patriotic singer, and it was going to take place right before the Russian election. I mean, again, everything about this kind of smells of Ukraine intelligence, and to me. And then, of course, later we had more information. They were fleeing towards the border with Ukraine, and then later the Russian investigative authorities found other links to Ukraine. Um, so it was, yeah, the kind of the target that they chose, the symbolism of it seemed to all things that would really matter to Ukraine, right? They were doing what they could to undermine Putin's authority. But this I think it's possible, it's quite possible that this was simply a jihadist attack that was carried out for jihadist reasons. Now, of course, you're right to be skeptical about that because the U.S. Has a long history of supporting jihadists, going back to, 1980, the support for the Mujahideen against Afghanistan, and it really ever since. So the U.S. could have been behind it, but I don't see the fingerprints on it at this point. Now, maybe, when the Russians do their investigations, they'll find them. But at this point, I think we have to say that at least it smells like something local
But what's the
and
motivation? I mean, why? I mean, it's not like Muslims are being persecuted
right,
in Dagestan. There doesn't seem, like we talk about like Chechnya, of a
right,
Muslim center of Russia, how much they love Russia and Putin.
right.
So why? Where is
Yeah.
this coming from?
Well, it could be. I mean, well, first of all, of course, it could be Western backed, but then you may have people that are actually, extremists who have a kind of a vision of a pure Islam that don't like the assimilation, they don't like the friendship between, the people of Dagestan and the rest of Russia. It's conceivable, it it doesn't seem to, yeah, it's all in all, it's Dagestan has been fairly peaceful over the last, to my knowledge, over the last decade or so. I mean, the early 2000s, there was a fair amount of violence. I don't know why it would start out, but I guess I would just say that again, that you can't, we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that everything's done by the evil puppet master. There could be local agency here. I think there's at least a
Hmm.
degree of local agency here. It's quite possible that there are, malcontents that wanted to do this, but they got some extra training and support from the West. That may be what happened. But again, we'll let the investigation go ahead. Now, in the case of Crimea and the attack of missiles, I think it's important to point out, what actually happened. There were 5 missiles that were fired, according to the Russians. 4 of them were destroyed, and the fifth one was was either hit or, maybe through electronic warfare means was caused to deviate from its intended trajectory. So anyway, it was diverted. And then it blew up over the beach and scattered debris, and I guess also, cluster munitions. As you were saying, it had a cluster munitions warhead. Anyway, if those were the initial reports coming from the Russians from RT, and if that's true, and I haven't seen anything to contradict it, that means that likely the beach itself was not the intended target. So we have to look at least at the possibility, because that would do the same. These things have happened going the other way, where either Russian missiles were actually diverted by Ukrainian air defense and ended up hitting an apartment building, or maybe the Ukrainian air defense missile fell on the apartment building, and then the Russians get blamed. I think we have to apply the same standards of truth here. Um, so it looks to me like that beach itself was not what was intended, but it seems that all 5 missiles were heading towards Sevastopol, and to my knowledge, Sevastopol doesn't have any military targets. The Navy's been moved farther east, out of range of these kind of missile strikes. Um, so it seems quite possible, likely, and certainly, what we know of the Ukrainians, and their Western supporters, it's very possible that they were intending to hit some other civilian targets. I don't know of any military targets that they could have hit within Sevastopol. Um, maybe
Wait,
they
well,
were
I'll
going to go
just
after something symbolic. That this is something that happened just a year ago, roughly. They hit I think the former headquarters of like the Black Sea Navy. It wasn't
well
being
just
used, but they hit it in Sevastopol.
to
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
push back a bit. Isn't there some air base that wasn't too far away from the beach? Could that have been the intended target? I heard there was a military
Okay.
air base not too far away.
Well, that could have been. I actually didn't hear about that. But see,
Hmm.
that we just have to be honest about this. That it could be, it's conceivable that they weren't
Right.
going after a civilian target here. I mean,
Okay,
again,
so
it's sort of
but
like but we also have to say that the Ukrainians do have a history of striking civilian targets. I mean, they've done it hundreds of times, and like in Donetsk City, and there was in the strikes on the Christmas market in Volgograd, where there's nowhere, and other strikes within Volgograd where there's just nothing. There was nothing but civilian, and same thing in Donetsk City. They clearly were intentional strikes on civilian targets. So I think it's a mistake, or to well, I think we have to be honest and say we don't know for sure that they were trying to strike a civilian target, but it's certainly very possible. Maybe more information will come out. Maybe we'll learn what the trajectory of these missiles are. These are ballistic missiles, so they have pretty much a fixed trajectory. And I suppose it's possible to, figure out exactly, where they were intended to land.
Okay, so you're saying though that it's highly unlikely that the beach was the intended target. Yeah, I
Right.
mean there's no military strategic value of striking a beach full of
Right.
beachgoers.
Right.
It's not a military base, and I think something that we could say is different between the shelling of Donetsk or Belgorod with artillery shells is that those don't require Western satellite guidance or U.S. intelligence to
Right.
operate that. What
Right.
happened here with the ATACMS and a very firm statement from Lavrov saying that this is a U.S. attack. He wants to blame the United States more than the Ukrainians on this, saying that
Right.
this was an attack guided by the United States. We input using our satellites, input it in. Maybe Ukrainian pushed the button, but it was
Right.
all authorized and approved by NATO or United States
Yeah.
intelligence. Um, so
But
yeah, it's a big escalation,
right.
but
Right.
hopefully,
Whatever. Right.
but it, yeah, like I said, hopefully, we will find out that this wasn't the intended target, and maybe it will help dampen things down. But Lavrov gave a very firm response right after this, saying
Right.
that the U.S. there will be an answer, that the U.S. is at fault for this, and we will respond. Um,
Mhm.
Scary.
Yeah.
So what does that
Right.
response mean? What do you think it could mean?
I don't know. Just to be honest, I just don't know. Well, again, there's one thing. It seems like, yeah, a possible response would be to actually go after U.S. drones over the Black Sea. Again, there were reports that there was a U.S. drone in the vicinity of this strike, um, and we know for a fact that that they're used in targeting. I believe Lavrov. I've heard on this. I mean, I've heard other reports uh, that also state that yeah, these ATACMS systems required U.S. targeting and operation. I know it's definitely true for other missile systems, and I've heard that's true for ATACMS too. So I don't have any reason to doubt that the U.S. was involved. Now they may not have been intending to get a beach, but it seems like they were firing missiles into a large city or in the vicinity of a large city in the middle of a Sunday. If anything, if nothing else, it was very reckless.
What has been the U.S. response to this so far? I haven't heard much coming out addressing
Well,
this incident.
yeah. Well, I think when I've heard the first time that U.S. authorities were asked about this, they said that they basically no comment, and then later they made a statement that, as always, we always regret civilian casualties, and that's all they said. It was a very general kind of statement.
Okay, so you think
And
we'll
then,
see?
but it was even worse with the European. I think it was the EU foreign policy spokesman said um, that he basically didn't believe the Russians. They must be lying about children dying. I think the actual statistics are that four were killed on the beach, two of them were children, 151 were injured, but some of them very seriously. So hopefully they'll
Yeah,
all
I
survive.
heard four, and then I heard that it got up to five or six, but I don't know.
Yeah.
This is so recent. Like I said, it's easy to jump to conclusions. I do that much more quickly than you do, so I'm glad you pull me back and say
Well,
let's
that's my
take a
job.
step back. Right, because I get on Twitter, I'm like, whoa, it's getting crazy. World War III,
Right. Well, I've seen a
coordinated.
lot of statements from
And
people I respect, saying that just flat out the U.S. is behind both of these. I think you can pretty much say that, yeah, no question the U.S. was involved in the attack and strike. Um, um, but that they were intending to hit the beach, that's a separate question. And it's not justified by what we know so far. But we just don't know if the U.S. was involved. Of course, we have a right to be very suspicious because of this history that they have of of associating using jihadists, but we just don't know.
yeah, yeah, I mean the Russians have to be out for blood, though. I mean, if you're
Yeah,
seeing this, first of all, they see, the Crocus City attack was horrific, right in their capital city in Moscow. That wasn't that long ago, what,
right.
3 months ago or so. And then, these attacks into Belgorod, which are Russia proper, like you said, striking the Christmas night market and killing civilians there.
Yeah,
Beachgoers, one of the
right.
victims, one of the children
Well, yeah,
that died
part
on
of
the
it,
beach
like
was.
all of these, whether it's intentional or not, and a lot of these past attacks clearly were intentional. You just never get a peep out of the Western media. They just ignore it. Which tells people, tells Russians, they really just don't care about Russian lives. They just don't. These are just not
Or
worthy of
Ukrainian lives,
consideration.
clearly.
Yeah,
2,000
well,
Ukrainian soldiers were dying a
well,
day in the past week.
yeah, right. Well, not certainly not Ukrainian soldiers. If yeah, but
Yeah, I heard one of the victims on the beach was the daughter of a mayor of some Russian city in the eastern
uh-huh,
province, a 9-year-old girl.
yeah,
And yeah, and I just started making me think about, like, when there's a terrible incident that happens in the United States, it gets plastered all over the news. It really stirs people up, and
yeah. Well,
but
yeah.
and
Think
so
about it.
imagine
Right, right,
what's happening
right.
in Russia. Russian media is
Yeah.
hearing this, like, you see an image of these children being killed, a night market getting bombed, the
Hmm.
Crocus City Hall where 100 people get gunned down, that are just shoppers or attending a concert. And then, seeing, what happened in Dagestan. It's just
Hmm.
the amount of anger that must be
Right.
building up in Russia
Yeah.
to do
I think.
something is going to be
Yeah.
high. And if we spend a little time to just put the shoe on the other foot and think about, what if this was happening here in the United States? What if we use the example of, if Russia was supplying missiles to the cartels in Mexico, and they would be shelling, El Paso or something like this, and kids were being killed with weapons that were, being sent from Russia, or Russian guidance, being all fully backed by Russia, we would have bombed Moscow to the Stone Age. We would have nuked them by now. If this was happening the other way around. So I think
Right.
I know people can get caught up in the war, but it's very important to try to empathize,
Yeah.
to try
Yeah.
to think about, like, what if
Yeah.
this was happening to my country, to my people?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
No. No.
and
It's. There's no question about it. I mean, that's it's. Um. And if in the end, also, yeah. I mean, it's hard to see like what clearly the Ukrainians have been striking civilian targets. We don't know exactly what went on, this last weekend, but clearly they have. And they give it, the reason is they're trying to destabilize Russia or, what um, cause the people to lose their faith in their leadership and so on. And that's not what happens. It never does. This kind of terrorism always backfires, and it just makes people a lot of times who may have been opposed to the war, didn't have any strong opinions, they end up becoming firmer supporters of the war. They say we've got to you know we we've got to carry this through to the end. These people are crazy. I've had enough of this. And
mm,
then you get
yeah.
people who are a little bit more intemperate saying things like we've got to flatten Kiev. Or now I fortunately we have a very cool cucumber at the top. But but he does. That's Putin, of course. But he does have to take into account, this feeling, this growing anger. That's something that he can't ignore.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, these types of attacks also just reek of desperation from
Yeah,
the West. It's just like what you can't actually beat the real army, the Russian army. So you're going to have to go after civilian population centers, because you can't actually, you can't beat Russia head on. And if you can't beat Russia head on, then it's just like clear, well, negotiate, stop doing
Hmm.
this. You have to reach a peace. Let's just stop the bloodshed. We can do it. There was, the a peace proposal put there. You may not like it, but that's fine. You state your position. Russia stated theirs. At least start talking, and you can
Uh-huh.
try to come to some compromise and agreement. I'm sure
Yeah.
that there's going to be some wiggle room going both ways if they actually talk, but there always is.
Right.
But we but now it's just disgusting that it seems like the U.S. and the Ukraine, NATO, they are resorting to essentially what we can call terrorism now, right? I mean, is that fair to say? Like that's what we've devolved into. Like
Yeah.
the greatest army in the world,
Yeah.
NATO and the United States, we have to launch attacks into civilian infrastructure because we can't even have any effect
Right.
moving the front line.
Well, okay. Well, again, we'll say that we don't know for sure that this was directed against a civilian target, right? This most
Okay,
recent
well,
one.
what about in
But
like Belgorod
yeah,
before, and
okay,
them
that was
saying
a
that we can
right.
launch
That was a
attacks into Russia?
vampire rocket system, which is checkmate. Now, I don't know if like the Czechs were involved in targeting an operation of the system. I just don't have any information on that. It's possible that the Ukrainians just did this on their own. I think you have to say, like, when you look at, in the shelling of Donetsk, and um, it's possible that this is done, by the Ukrainians just by themselves without Western encouragement or,
Yeah, but there are
involvement.
shells, are
Yeah,
backing. I
well,
mean,
that's right. Okay, well, it's our weapons, especially like with these. I never heard anything from the Czechs, after the Christmas market attack. There should have been some firm denunciation and say, this is not what this was intended for. This was we're supposed to be defending Ukraine, not killing innocent Christmas shoppers in Belgorod. But they never said anything. That's right. And when a lot of these other attacks have happened, you get these leaks, for example, in the New York Times or the Washington Post, weeks or maybe months later saying, oh, we didn't want them to do that. And it's sort of some wringing of the hands. Um, and yeah, maybe they didn't, but they let them do it. And they obviously don't prevent them from doing it again. And so they're, no matter what, even if they're not like directly involved, if they're not directing these attacks on civilians, I have to say that they're complicit. They're supplying the weapons, and they're maybe telling them, oh, don't use these, on attacks against Russian civilians or any
hmm
civilians. Maybe they actually say that, but then the Ukrainians ignore it, and then they give them more weapons. So what does
right.
that
They
tell you?
don't.
It's sort of like the U.S. and Israel too.
I
It
was
just,
just going to say
right,
exactly
right,
right. We say, oh, we're concerned when they drop a 2,000 bomb on an
right,
apartment building, and that's it. I mean, but we'll keep on
right,
giving you weapons. Oh, but we're very
right.
concerned about
Right.
what's happening
Yeah.
here.
So even if
Um,
they're not, it's not like, maybe the U.S. didn't actually choose a civilian target and encourage them. Probably not. Probably not. I mean, there are probably some crazies in the U.S. like Victoria Nuland who would if she could get away with it. But they let it happen, and they facilitate it. They in the end they're guilty. I mean, it's just like they maybe trying to achieve some sort of separation between themselves and their Ukrainian proxy, but it's not real. It's phony.